Okay, good afternoon. I am Anto Budiarjo. Welcome to Monday Live. This is something that we do every Monday afternoon to try and figure out what the future for smart buildings is all about. So it's great to have you with us today. In case you're wondering who we are, our profiles are listed on mondaylive.org. Probably not of Keith yet, so we'll add that and everything else. The other point I always make is just to remind everyone that the views expressed here are personal, not of any company or organization. Just keep that in mind. And please do post questions and conversation dialogue on the Zoom chat. Find it's much more better, as they say, when we make it interactive. And this slide deck is available on mondaylive.org as well, if you want anything on these slides. So this is the month of July, and we have been talking about our theme of July, which is integrating building silos, all the different silos in buildings. So that's our theme. We're sort of in the middle of that. We've got a couple more weeks before the end of the month. It's the topic in terms of agenda and normal news and trends, sort of chit chat. Then we want to dive into the integrating building silos and really talk about Linux and why it is an important component for buildings. So really looking forward to that and the discussion afterwards. But before we go there, I'm going to hand it over to Ken Sinclair for some news on from Automated Buildings. What's going on, Ken?
Thanks, Anto. Couple of things I wanted to point out is we've got a post from Buildings IT, and they're using a couple of words that I'm not sure that I've heard used in our industry so much, adaptive buildings and workflows. And so it's an interesting twist. I'm always kind of watching the words that we're using to try and describe. Then the next one is about training your dragon, and Keith Gibson gets dragged into that. So that's kind of a fun poke at what we need to do, and based on the whimsical How to Train a Dragon movie from a while back. So AI is the dragon, and I think Keith is that dragon slayer, so it's a fun little poke. Some other things that are going on is our sponsor from Australia, Lifecycle Controls. They basically do training, and it's the first time I've seen training for mechanical consultants, and I think that's an important piece of the puzzle. We haven't really delved in. I don't know that anybody's taken on that task. It's a needed task, so it's kind of a good read as well. We did a roll-up of last week's Monday Live and reimagining the smart building cases and breaking down the silos, and it links into weeks before, and kind of this whole series is kind of flowing on our site. Anto and I were talking before we started here, and whether anybody's reading this, and there's kind of another thing, I think, with all of this work we're doing, putting together the Zoom, spending hours of our time, it's worthwhile for us to just to have a tag somewhere. And the other thing is it's starting to be read more by other groups. As I posted on other groups, we're starting to get the situation that quite often I posted on another group and I get more reads on the other group than I do mine. And I thought that was a bad thing, but I think now that's a good thing. And I think that's exactly where we are in our industry, is we've got to kind of pull our thoughts together and then share our thoughts with another industry. And of course, Linux is a proper, as a basically a great example of that. There's a post there from Steve Dodds. As always, it's a good one. So I've just put a wee little icon. His graphics are so great that you don't need much of them to get the whole idea. Does a great job of his AI generated graphics. And then the other last leading remark is that we're finding that at both ends of the scale, we're seeing that people need help kind of putting together their messages. The old idea of a press release isn't really, there's so much to read these days, nobody's reading them. So you have to basically unpack it and try and bring out a story that is inside of the releases. And so we're trying to help some folks do that. And the same thing, we're starting to see that some of the folks that don't have brand managers and stuff need help as well. So we're trying to provide that. We try to make it easy to post on Automated Buildings, and that's working for some people really well. But some people need a little bit of help, and we're seeing that that's a market for us, is to bring them on and introduce their new products to us all. So anyway, that's what we're trying to do. We're reinventing ourselves every day, trying to find out what we should do best. But I think, as always, what Automated Buildings has done is it's just left a bunch of links and a bunch of information that you can kind of go into a focused search of what's happening in the automated buildings industry. Back to you.
Great, thank you, Ken. So Dragon Slayer, Keith, you have a new name now, Dragon Slayer.
Yeah, that was pretty fun.
Would you care to, since you're new to this group as of this week, you want to do a little intro of yourself?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So Keith Gibson, CEO and founder of Facil.ai. We have a AI-based advanced supervisory control system, which is kind of an overlay on top of building control systems to have more precise and better control of the BMS. It's assistive, and kind of think of it like an automatic tune-up, constantly in the background, 24/7, 365. That was a fun post that Thomas Trang did for me. He's over at American University. He's a HVAC technician at the university, and he's a part-time writer. And boy, I was, Ken, I was really impressed by his content. Like, it's almost like I got to hire that guy as like my director of marketing or something. It was really a great, it's weaving that story. As you were saying earlier, stories kind of resonate with people, not just like press release dry, content. But yeah, that's really, I was very fortunate that he volunteered to kind of, make that analogy with the slaying of the AI, slaying the dragon or actually training the dragon.
Actually, Thomas is an interesting fellow. He started as a bicycle mechanic in Vietnam, and
yeah,
he came to America. So it's a long story, a long journey for him. And yeah. So I too am just blown away by his ability to write and to understand a lot of stuff. So yeah, it's good, and it's a fun poke, and it's well done.
Yeah, and it's true. I mean, that I'm still struggling with that. I mean, I just find it amazing. I was talking to a potential customer in the UAE. They've got 7,000 tons of cooling. It's 125 degrees over there, and they were running out of capacity on their central plant. And it's like, yeah, now's the time to optimize it. And they came back and said they didn't want to chance it because the AI might bring their plant down and all this kind of stuff. And I just kind of find it's funny to me because these same people they trusted me 30 years ago when I was programming the little Commodore 64 in a can hanging on the wall. It's just it's kind of a joke. I mean, come on, the AI is not going to dump your chiller off, dude. Like, it's just not. So I was finding that. So I don't know what to do, how to get around that. It just engage more and more customers and get more proof points But yeah, that it's absolutely ridiculous thinking that the AI is going to ever do something to dump a chiller offline. Like, no, that's not how it works. It'll actually keep it from going offline. And I think that one more point I'd like to make about AI in that, I forgot I forgot the name of it, but it's Markov's paradox or something like that. Like, what's easy for humans is difficult for AI, and what's difficult and complex for humans is easy for AI. I've learned that. When I first started Phoenix Energy several years ago, I thought that we could use AI for the simple tasks, like schedule changes or a set point adjustment after a strip and wax at a Sears or something. And we would let the AI do the easy stuff, and we would let the humans do the complex stuff like troubleshooting and even advanced optimization in real time. And it's just the opposite. It's just the opposite. AI, the more complex the problem is, the better that AI can handle it. So I've learned so much in the last 4 years, but that's one of the major things that, AI and machine learning, it thrives on complexity. So we just got it exactly backward as an industry. Like, we ought to be bringing this stuff to this technology to bear. And yeah, that's what we're working on and all about. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Keith. Thanks. Great for you to be part of this group. So moving off of this slide, on normal community link boards, just there for any links that you may want. The RealComm IBCon video is now on this link if you need that. Before we move on, any other thoughts or news anyone want to bring up? Hearing nothing, let us move on then. This being July, we want to talk about silos. And just to go through what we've been doing the last couple of weeks, we spent the first week in July talking about really what the silos, the common silos are that exist in buildings, and we were trying to sort of make sense of, are there any patterns in this and how important they are. We all felt that there was thinking about it in the silo is very important, but we kind of felt that we needed a way of thinking about it. So the following week, which was last week, we took the sort of fact that apps are really what we humans use when we come to doing things with computers. And maybe by looking at the silos from an app's perspective, that could tell us something. So we did this matrix that we spent last week on the show. We're trying to sort of figure out if there's a way of actually thinking about apps such as these listed here, and whether there's a way of actually measuring the relevance of a silo to a particular app. So we spent the whole week, the whole show doing that, and the sort of our conclusion at the end of it is that trying to score it is just too much hassle, too much work, and really, if there is any value, there is going to be some value that can be extracted by some innovation that happens that we don't really know yet. So it's more of a binary thing, and we think that there's a lot of data in a lot of these silos that can actually be useful for a lot of apps. And this matrix is not completed, so it's just sort of that sort of realization that it's really much more of a binary thing and it's useful. So that was last week, and this week we're going to be talking about Linux. So why are we talking about Linux when we are in a month of silos? Really, the reason is, I think somebody mentioned it earlier on the call here, is that if you think of these silos, each one of those silos is a domain, is an industry. And if you really sort of dig into all those industries, there's an awful lot of Linux all over the place in pretty much any domain, any industry you care to think about, because of just the popularity and the use of Linux. Maybe not all the way to the very edge devices. I sort of think of fire and life safety. I'm not sure a fire detector would be running Linux, and I'm not sure it will ever. I don't think that's the point, but in terms of the system of information and data, we see Linux everywhere. So what is Linux? So just a little bit of a history of Linux. And you really can't talk about Linux without first talking about Unix, which is obviously a really important operating system that was developed by the Bell Labs in around the early 70s. But Bell Labs or AT&T was not allowed to be a computer company. It could not be a computer company because of regulations, federal regulation. So it licensed it mainly to a whole bunch of academia research organizations. And from that was created a whole many different sort of versions of Unix, which were not necessarily compatible with each other, which were driving a lot of people crazy, especially as they were trying to develop apps. So there's this project called GNU, that was started to create a framework of creating apps for the Unix operating system. So GNU is not actually Unix, and that's actually what GNU stands for, is that GNU is not Unix. Some geek humor back from the 1980s. So it's basically GNU was the apps that was running on Unix, but Unix itself was a mess. So this Finnish student, Linus Torvalds, decided in 1991, as part of his school project or university project, to create Linux. And he did. He did it as an open source, and he obviously got an awful lot of support from other people, and it became quickly very, very successful. The mascot that you often see is a thing called Tux, which is kind of like a tuxedo, but it also stands for Torvalds Unix. A little bit of history. Linux runs on pretty much everything. That's one of the nice things about it. It's been ported to pretty much everything. And it runs pretty much on every server that sits on the internet. There's somewhere in that server there's a Linux. So Linux is distributed as packages of what's called distributions. The geeks call them distros, because they don't like to say distributions, I guess. That's listed some of the distributions that are out there. Debian and Ubuntu are typically the popular ones. And Linux gets used with a GUI, like a window Mac kind of user interface, as in laptop, but more frequently is being used as a headless server sitting in on the internet rack somewhere. And it runs from everything from embedded devices to supercomputers. So it's really sort of very scalable. And it is managed by the Linux Foundation, which I'm going to ask Rick to speak about in a moment. Why is it used everywhere? Why is it sort of dominant? It's because of these things that if I were to ask Rick, he'll just say it's better, cheaper, and faster. Right, Rick?
Just that simple.
It's stable and has all of those things. The open source and the cost of it is obviously part of the cheaper part of it. It's just very good. I don't know how else to say it. As an operating system, especially if you compare it to the other operating systems, and there aren't really that many. So this is why it gets used. It is talking about using Linux. When we started the IBB project, it was a pretty obvious choice that it's really needs to be built around Linux. And this is a typical IBB diagram. The operating system itself is Linux. The admin functions is typically Linux apps that's running either in containers or in some other sort of way on the IBB box. The containers that get installed in the IBB are typically Linux, although they don't have to be. It's kind of a little caveat that's kind of interesting. Technically, you can have a Windows, a container containing a Windows operating system running just fine. Typically these days, because of the modularity of Linux. Most containerized applications are Linux. And even the cloud management platform is typically going to be Linux. But again, that doesn't have to be. There's a lot of Linux everywhere. And if you think about the Linux Foundation, I'm going to hand it over to Rick here. Tell us about the Linux Foundation, why that's important.
So the Linux Foundation, as opposed to Linux or the operating system or the kernel, the Linux Foundation is an organization that it just embodies the concept of communities coming together to work on technologies, mostly software, but usually technologies and or standards efforts, where all these different companies come together for the community good. Just that simple. So it's a nonprofit organization oriented around the concept of open source. So whatever gets created as part of a Linux Foundation project, most, if not all of it, gets released into the open source community. And that's what, so you've got these like thousands of companies and you're seeing the logos. And if you can see any one of those logos, recently they just added a new logo to this chart, and one of the new company or organizations that's a member of the Linux Foundation.
I looked for it. I couldn't find it.
Okay, maybe they're a little behind, but it would be it would be this one. The C4SB logo is now going to be joined as part of that little Linux Foundation. So the Linux Foundation is a community of thousands of participants and companies that come together. As you see here on the screen, a $175 million annual budget, thousands of projects, $750,000 code contributions. It is where IT professionals go to get things done, for best practices, for solving problems, for creating solutions to whatever the problem is and whatever domain they're in. IT professionals go participate in these Linux Foundation projects because it's the shortcut to getting solutions done, as opposed to trying to do things in proprietary ways exclusively. Now, there's nothing that says you can't take this open source code and then build proprietary apps on top of it. And that's what I'd say probably 90% of these companies are, and the individuals participating are doing. But the key part of it is that the shortcuts that you get and the best practices that you get and the code base that you can just easily download is community driven, very thoroughly thought through, worked through, tested, etc. And so the rising tide lifts all boats, and that's the concept of why people participate in Linux. We feel strongly that the future of buildings is in tech. Obviously, that's why we get together every week. Future of buildings is tech. The future of tech is definitely Linux. And as my daughter, the math teacher, would say, the transitive property means the future of buildings is Linux.
Thank you. So that is the Linux Foundation, and that's it. That's all about Linux. And let's open it up to conversation and discussion. I think most of the people on the screen here, or the companies that we are all associated with, are all using Linux to some degree. So that may be a good starting point of conversation, but would love to get everybody's thoughts on why Linux is important.
Actually, a quick one I'd like to add in my 50 years of automation experience. It's the thing of Linux is it doesn't crash. It's simply that. And all the other operating systems, eventually somewhere they go off into la la land and we have to reboot them. But I find that Linux is, in my experience and everything I've used in Linux in my lifetime, has never crashed. I don't know how they do that. It's amazing.
Yeah, that's that first bullet on why it's being used is stability and reliability. You're right. It really doesn't crash. If it does go wrong, it's something else that's causing it.
Yeah, it might do the wrong thing, but it doesn't stop doing it, yeah. Which is great. Definitely what we need. Bulletproof. I just
Well, that's
wanted-
one of the key things from a technology standpoint, to point out the difference between, real-time operating systems, which we've usually had in automation systems, and then either time sharing or interrupt-driven operating systems. There used to be much more of a distinction between the two, and one would run all the time, just turn it on and it runs all the time. The other would crash all the time. Once Linux came out, because of the way Linux was built, that concept of crashes, pretty much went away. So yeah, there's Linux systems that have been turned on 30 years ago and that are running just fine. And you could probably turn it off and not have to worry about whether it would come back on.
Although Linux itself is not regarded as a real-time operating system, just to make that clear, because that's a very special beast that is all involved with extremely low latency. So it's typically not something that is done with Linux, although there is some distributions of Linux that focuses on real-time applications. So how much do you guys use Linux?
Well, I think just to come back to your earlier point, Anto, you also got to recognize where do you use Linux, right? So I wouldn't use Linux in my smart lamp, light. It's a little bit bloated and it's not classed as a real-time operating system in that regard, right? So where I've got mission critical stuff operating at, at a systems level, and you could argue whether any of our stuff is mission critical. Especially in the industrial world, then RTOS has really come into their own. But once you start talking about processing of data and how do you move stuff around and how do you move stuff up and down and how do you see it and how do you interact with it and all that sort of stuff, then you're more into the user side of the house than the actual the machine side of the house in some context. But having said that, it'll work just fine down at the gateway level. When you're down at that level too.
And since we're talking about what people are not using Linux for, as part of this conversation, desktop UI is typically not Linux. Most of the desktops in the world, 98%, is not Linux. Linux only represents a very, very tiny part. Most of it is obviously Windows and Mac OS, and Mac OS is effectively Unix, but it's not Linux.
Well, you can go one further, right, in that even today, most systems, the UX experience these days is web, right? There's some native web application, which is an important point because the web doesn't, web applications now are tied to the OS that you're running underneath on the web. You could run web applications on Windows servers, on Linux servers, on Mac servers if you wanted to. But when you get into that space, when especially you have UXs, web-based UXs, now you really plow into the strength of Linux, right? And that's one of the big advantages of Linux at that level.
To actually serve out those web pages,
right?
And not to have to worry about the environment where it is being displayed, which is displayed in a web browser running on the Windows or Macs. It doesn't care. It doesn't matter.
Right.
Would you say it's the language of the cloud? Anto, would you?
I would say it's the operating system of the cloud, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure if that's is a right way of thinking about it.
Which is another dimension of that is the cost angle. When you start to run, if you're running in Azure or AWS, if you're starting to run Windows servers in the cloud, significantly more expensive cost than a Linux server. So, you know, in our environments, most of our servers are Linux servers. A big part of that is both cost and also security, by the way. There's another dimension of security. So Linux has got a much better security model. Windows has come a long way, of course, since. But yeah, the cost of running a Windows machine, and anybody who's, you know, trying to run some large application on a Windows machine in the cloud will tell you there's a big cost advantage to it.
Is that because of the processing time or what?
No, it's more about the licensing ways, the way that they license it.
Okay.
Okay.
And Jim, can you speak to how Linux is being used in your world, in the sort of the BACnet world?
Absolutely. So we've been using Linux for many years now. And the thing that I like about it the most is that you can control when updates happen.
Yeah.
You know, I think that it's, you know, this concept that I'm sure we've all been getting ready to log into a meeting and suddenly have realized that you no longer have control over your computer and that it's decided to do an update. You know, for the kinds of things that we do in industrial and process control, that's just a non-starter. It's not that I, you know, certainly the updates are available for Linux, but it allows me to use it when I want to, not when it's decided that it needs to.
We use Linux in our gateway as well. Our new one, at least. And I think the besides security and stability, cost for us is a really important thing because of the format that our systems are typically going into. You know, small restaurants, small buildings, small budgets. So because of the scalability of Linux, it allows us to pick versions that are free and or low cost to license. So,
Which is another good point, right? Because people also get concerned about, you know, quote unquote, the free versions and what's the, and there's absolutely reasons for it, like Tracy said. And then the other end of the spectrum, of course, there are supported full enterprise supported versions like Red Hat, right? If you want to go with a full supported enterprise solution, then go with Red Hat as an example. There are others. And so now you get full support, you get full updates, you get the maintenance, you know what you're running is always the latest, you know, most solid release. You're in control of when you do updates, like Jim said, and you've got a much more robust environment. But to Tracy's point, then you can scale it right down to, you know, down to the gateway and go with something, you know, not as enterprise grade.
And so, I'm sorry, when you have, as Anno said, when you have a cybersecurity requirement and you need to show a software bill of materials in order to comply with standards like 62443 or other secure software development lifecycle models, you need to have something that's supported so that you can tell, you know, what the provenance of that open source product is, so it's traceable.
Right. I think Tracy hit on the other point, right? It's the scalability, that you can go from an enterprise grade cloud environment all the way down to the gateway level. Hard to do with other OSs, right? Windows has had several attempts at that, right? They tried the embedded Windows, they tried the Windows 10.
Windows CE.
Windows
You go back in time.
Yeah, if you go back some time.
XP embedded. Yeah.
Right.
Windows, yeah.
So they've really struggled trying to scale Windows from small to large.
I'll put this out as a question too. Another kind of important reason here we're talking about this. So part of the overall architecture for IBB includes Kubernetes.
Yes.
And that part of it. Now I know Windows supports other forms of containerization, but does it support Kubernetes on Windows, or is that only a Linux thing?
You can make it work. It is a nightmare. I mean, we've tried to make it work. It's not, you got to know what you're doing to make Kubernetes work on Windows. And then back to Jim's point, you get an arbitrary Windows update and it blows it all away.
And there's a thing called WSL, which is the Windows system for Linux,
Right.
So-
which actually allows you to run Linux operating system within Windows. But again, similar to what Anna was saying, my understanding is that it's a little bit flaky and it's a little bit kind of a strange version of Linux because it's kind of wrapped in Windows.
Yeah, you got to know what you're doing to make it.
Yeah.
To make it work. And which
So-
is actually the other point. Sorry, Steve. But the other side of the spectrum is the number of resources and people who know how to run Linux environments. Right. I mean, you can go to the marketplace and get there's a lot of people who've got Linux experience, both enterprise and scaled down capabilities. Sorry, Steve.
Yeah, I guess I this is more of a question for the team here. To your point, Anna, with regard to developers. So needless to say, Microsoft community has a lot of developers in it, right? Not just on the Windows platform, but on Azure as well. And then at the application level, of course, they have lots of people who've written applications to run in Windows, right? So the question really for us is, we're choosing Linux, or I would say we're favoring Linux for the scalability, the fact that it can go down to a great gateway and go on up to enterprise, the fact that it's open source, the fact that you can have control over your destiny about when updates are done, for example. So there are a lot of compelling reasons in our industry specifically that make Linux attractive. But from a developer standpoint, and I would ask the question around this application environment that we want to foster, this open application environment that we want to foster. How much confidence do we have in Linux versus Windows? Okay, because so much application has been done in Windows. Is our industry going to be well served having basically, voted largely to go in the direction of Linux versus Windows?
Well, my answer to that is, if you look at the UI part of it, the user, how we use things, how we use applications, it's really what Anna was saying, right? That's all HTML now. That's all web-based, right? And that is delivered by Linux just as easy as how it's being delivered by a Windows application.
Okay.
Right. Linux is highly suitable for that, and it's highly scalable for that. So when you're thinking of Windows, in a way, I'm not quite sure what you mean by that Windows application.
Native Windows, I'm guessing.
I'm talking native Windows applications, right?
And in the enterprise, large businesses, user apps. I think that's what Steve's talking about, is like there's an awful lot of applications that are Windows apps for productivity, for enterprise apps. The innovation, and so like Keith was standing up, and I think he was doing the wave. I'm not sure what he was doing there.
Oh yeah,
but,
like energy savings exercise every 10 minutes.
But innovators and entrepreneurs are going to be the much more leaning towards based on whatever they're building, whatever they're innovating around Linux. So, and the number of folks you've got to be able to draw on in terms of talent and resources and best practices and code base, is pretty darn robust on the Linux side. So yeah, a lot of confidence all up and down the stack, by the way. So whether it's on the edge, with devices and Linux running on a Raspberry Pi, to do some odd new thing like opening a cat door for Anno's house or something.
Winner product.
Or Linux running up at a supervisory level, or Linux running in a server level, or in a user-facing app. So lots all up and down the stack.
I think from Sorry,
Oh,
go ahead, David.
I'd love to, Steve, I think that's a great question. And I think that the days of a Windows-based PC running an executable application should be a thing of the past when it comes to building management. And these should be SaaS applications that are cloud-based. And the driver for those Windows servers was to run these executables and Windows server-based applications, a decade plus ago that are still in use. And the migration should be to cloud-based SaaS applications that can be hosted on any machine with a browser. And that browser ideally could connect directly with the cloud with those applications, or could have an on-prem connection to the IBB if a local SaaS was desired to be hosted locally for some reason.
Right.
So I think it really, it's not a thing of saying goodbye to, it's saying goodbye to Windows-based executable applications for building management is my hot take.
David, that's exactly where I was going, is that you've got a lot of installed base, a lot of history there in Windows architectures for applications. And we're just assuming that, this migration is going to happen to Linux for compelling reasons. Okay.
Yeah.
How confident are we? And because now's the time to really be critical of amongst ourselves in that regard.
Yeah. And I don't think of it as A to B at all. I think of it as, what the current state is to a distributed thing. And it's Linux for the IBB and the IBB applications, but it's also cloud first and cloud native, which is where those SaaS things come from. And so it's both together. It's not Windows or Linux. It's Windows or Linux and the cloud.
Yeah. In fact, I'd probably go another way to frame Steve's question might be how easy, or is it the right operating system to build mobile applications, right? And if we're moving away from the PC and moving more mobile centric type, if I was a large controls company looking to build the next generation application like Steve's talking about it, would I don't know, I'd build it on Linux or Windows per se. I'm probably start to look like more, how can I build more mobile centric applications? And then the question becomes, is my back end Linux or Windows?
Right, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's actually a good question, because I'm not sure. I don't know from a developer's perspective, does mobile really care whether it's a Windows backend or a Linux? Probably not, right?
No, and the other thing about mobile and tablet apps are more and more, they are basically HTML apps wrapped in an app that you download, but it's basically it's a web page.
It's a browser app.
It's a browser app.
What they call device responsive apps, yeah.
And obviously, Android, by the way, is actually Linux inside. Android is effectively a Linux distribution. Right. So most of the smartphones in the world are Linux.
But so just circling back to Steve's question, and I think it's actually a really good question, right? If you were, there is an install base, you've got to deal with the install base. It's not going to go away in any time soon, right? So those suppliers, manufacturers will have the constant battle of, as Windows upgraded, it's unlikely they're going to change to a Linux. They will probably change more to the web-based approach like we were talking about, as opposed to, as an example, I don't know, but Tritium, right? Almost everything that you do on Tritium is all web-based, right? They don't actually have any. Is there any native application that Tritium has?
Yeah, the web-based is an application. The workbench, sorry, that's what it's called, is a Windows application, as far as I'm aware.
but there's also a web version of that. Isn't there not?
I think that's what they are in the
Yes.
process of rolling out with the.
Well,
with their
that's
new
kind of,
version.
and I guess I'm using that
Yeah.
as my example, right? As an
Yeah,
example. Okay, so they had a Windows application, the workbench, but moving it now to a web-based
Mhm.
approach.
Correct.
Yeah, Brian says the browser version is pretty good now. Yeah. Yeah. So that I guess that's my example, Steve, right? Is that's probably the approach that folks will go instead of building a native Windows app or Linux app. It's going to
Right.
be a browser-based approach. That changes
Exactly.
And I think the other thing is that we understand a Windows app. We know what it looks like. It's got a .exe at the end of it usually, but I'm not and you run it and you do things on it, right? I'm not sure Linux apps are generally like that. I mean, there are obviously the sort of the word processing apps type things, but most of the apps that are running Linux are little apps that just do little things, little services, or just displays a little rectangle of that goes in your a web page of some sort, right? So you don't have the similar thing that you have in Windows of actually just having an app, or you don't tend to have that anyway. Is that right?
Yeah, I think, but again, you're saying the same thing, right? Is that the application, the user experience, instead of the user experience being a native application that's written in, whatever, running on the Windows machine, dealing with all whatever it's talking with, it's the user experience is now moving more to a web-based application. I mean, I'm not sure in your organizations, because even in my organization today, even the Office applications like Word and Excel and PowerPoint and stuff, I use more and more their web application than I do the native app on my, in this case, Mac, but then I use the native app because it's much more collaborative and it lets me share better between users when I'm trying to do edits and stuff, and I can share stuff. And people don't have to download it and all this sort of gear, and I don't have to have versions and all, because they just go to where I have it on the SharePoint. And so even those applications are becoming more web-based, right?
Office 365, et cetera. I mean, that's what we are. I mean,
Yeah.
just to kind of chime in, like, I feel that Linux is the appropriate choice, especially for a gateway and embedded system gateway device, which you're talking Python is really the language that you're talking about. So, but yeah, we're an Azure shop, Microsoft Azure, just because it also depends, I think, on where you're playing. For example, 93% of all web servers are Linux based or Unix based, but then 95% of all corporate Fortune 500 web servers are Azure based. So it just really depends on where your market is. And the other point that I wanted to maybe get into Steve's point is development resources and speed of quality of your tools and your IDE for your development folks. So we're a C# shop, and I mean, I just feel there's a ton of resources around and support. I think that's really the difference when you start talking about, again, Fortune 500 type stuff, where you've got the support, there's one throat to choke, you're maybe doing it more often, but at least, Microsoft, you can get paid support and all that stuff. So yeah, I see it both ways, but yeah, we're an Azure shop. And I mean, yeah, there's a cost advantage as well, but in our world that Azure supports, Ubuntu and all that stuff. And it's the difference between, I can get a Windows 2022 data center server, SQL Server instance for $165 a month, whereas I could have got, the Linux version for $60.
Right.
It's like, it's relative.
So we seem to be in violent agreement that Linux is a good thing.
Yes.
So I don't think anybody's arguing against that. And I guess, so what for buildings? I mean, we're obviously talking about the context. So why is this important? Why is it important to have such an operating system for buildings? why are we talking about it now?
So I would love to have an opening salvo with that. And it's primarily because I did not come up through the HVAC BMS industry. And so I would like to pose this open question to this august brain trust. How is a Linux-based thing going to flip on its head $1,000 per point mentality that all of these BMS systems have been built on historically? Because that has been holding back innovation. I open it up to the floor.
How does it change the business model is basically what you're saying. Great question.
I
Anybody
think
have
that
an
comes
answer?
back to,
Wow, nobody jumped on that one.
no, I'll take a first
That
pass.
grenade. Let's jump on that grenade.
Yeah. No, I'll take a first pass. So, it's undoubtedly going to turn heads. This won't be the first time in the history of our industry that there have been existential threats to the existing business model of the big guys. And in my experience, there is an evolution that happens where initially there is support for that. And then there are ways that companies find to add value and subsequently close up and subsequently make proprietary and more expensive again over time. I would expect to see a similar cycle occur around this sort of a thing, right? And I'll even throw in, it's not just the lower potential cost per point that this represents, but also the openness and ease of which data is exchanged and systems are intermingled and or replaced and connected. So we've seen it. Jim, I know I'm speaking of a lot of my lawn market experience. You probably saw similar things in the BACnet world as well when those two open interoperable platforms hit the market.
Absolutely, Tracy. And I think that, fundamentally, Linux will help. It will be a factor in opening the market up. But I actually think that it's not, that the problems of our market are not really technology centric. They're really procurement centric, as I've said many times. And if we don't change the procurement, the $1,000 barrier is a procurement problem. It is really not a technology problem. And we need to actually be able to assign the variable cost of the real expense we have in our business, rather than spreading it over a number of boxes and multiplying by 1,000.
So I'll add another shot in a different direction, and then building on my experience from working for a large controls company. We all know that the cost of the hardware and the cost of the software from the actual manufactured cost of the software and the hardware from any of the large controls companies is nowhere related to the $1,000 per point, right? Because it doesn't cost them dollars. It doesn't cost them dollars to make the controls. It doesn't cost them much. What it really costs is the development time and the effort and all the investment that they plowed into it.
It's the engineering.
It's the engineering, right? All the engineering and all the time and everything else that they've plowed into it to get it to that point, and they're trying to obviously recoup those costs now to do so, which makes sense. I mean, that's normal business. I think what you do see, back to my favorite subject, what Linux has done is reduced that engineering time for the small startup guys, right? The IoT guys who've come in there and changed the equation and have really, tacked the controls industry at the lower level stuff with some of the IoT areas where, maybe controls guys aren't supposed to be in the IoT space, right? So I think it's had an impact in that regard. And it'll be interesting to see how it changes for the larger companies. I don't think it will per se. I think the impact you're going to find is more of the disruptors in the space, folks like Keith here.
It creates an opportunity for perpetual innovation,
Right,
which keeps everybody honest.
on their toes, yeah.
On the subject of procurement, IT departments are starting to weigh in on anything that's connected, and IT departments may be the procurement breakthrough by demanding that systems be Linux based. I mean, I'm cutting out a whole bunch of parts of that, but that's one of the things we're trying to do with the IBB is to say, oh, look, here is an alternative that is Linux based, IT friendly. And if we can get the IT department to weigh in on the with the procurement department, then that could be a shortcut to like owners demanding that all the different things that are operating inside their building that are connected one way or another have certain characteristics, and Linux is going to be the basis for that list of characteristics. So as the battle between we're talking about history of Unix, and there were like 8 different Unix wars, and we've been talking over the past couple of years about the battles between OT and IT. As that battle, like what happened in the Unix wars, they all were settled and people came together. As IT and OT comes together, we're creating this offering up of a Linux-based OT solution that is IT friendly in the IBB, and that hopefully will. And then you can use Python to program the darn sequence of operations. You can use Python or some other off-the-shelf.
Actually, it should be just the prompt you give.
Right.
Yeah, so
But if I could say one more thing about, what you were just referring to, Rick, I really see an opportunity here where the innovation happens because there isn't this super high cost of entry.
Yeah.
And I think that
Right.
by enabling, go ahead if you want
Well,
to
is it
interrupt that.
I don't know that it's the high cost of entry, but it's the protected cost of entry. So to do programming or sequence of operations now on a particular brand of controller, you have to be licensed. You have to be.
Completely agree. Completely agree. I was thinking more like, there are 3 office buildings 2 blocks away from me at the corner of Peterson and Cicero. I know none of them have a building management system. I know none of them have lighting control because it's too expensive. Now,
Yeah.
could all 3 of those buildings be more efficient and remotely monitored and all of that good stuff if there was a lower cost of entry to enable that? Absolutely. That's where I was going.
I do want to.
yeah, so David,
Sorry, go ahead.
I think the word that's been added is enablement. And that's my hope that Lennox is going to bring us, because that $1,000 a point you mentioned, but what was mentioned earlier is that the hardware is a fraction. It's 20% or less, okay, of that $1,000. So what makes up the 80%? Well, there's some installation costs, right? Obviously, and then there's all the labor to deploy, to do the local engineering. Okay, whether it's the application programming, the design documentation, all of that, right? So the hope that I have for Linux by going that route is it's an enablement, because it works from embedded devices up to the cloud. It enables application development by a wide range of across all the silos that Anto brought up earlier. That barrier essentially is taken down. And if we continue the development we're talking about on the IBB, where we instruct and show how you can make the applications easily interoperate, okay, through connection profiles, now all of a sudden I think, have the opportunity to dramatically lower the cost of that application engineering, that field engineering. And because of what's going on with hardware, particularly around wireless, you get to lower the installed cost of these systems concurrently. That's the promise, to take the $1,000 a point down to maybe $500 a point. That opens up these markets that you're hoping to get into.
Sure. And let me just say one thing, this IT/OT thing, I think a good model to follow is IT and the telco guys. I was at Morgan Stanley when telco was under IT, and they're like, no, we need our own network. And no. The phone system needs to be PoE and be in the IT network.
Right.
And this is the same type of transition we need to see, I think.
Another point is that we're not the only industry that is doing this. And
Yeah.
as we move into that industry, we'll get the ideas and the innovation. And that's going to be huge because Jim Lee has always said that that's one of our problems is scale. We don't do millions of stuff, but the people we're touching using Linux are doing millions of stuff, and they're going to teach us how. And then the other big problem I see it solving is we're starved for resources as we
Yeah.
move into this new environment. If we have financial reason for some of these Linux people to come and work with us, and they tend to write little bits and pieces that we can probably piggyback into our system. So I think we're going to grow incredibly fast as we touch them, and we're going to do things completely different than we've ever done before. So I think it's just a huge opportunity.
And that's great, Ken. And we're discussing this as part of trying to figure out how to integrate silos, right? So Roger made a good point in chat. This kind of it's not the Linux itself, but it's the Linux kind of and the cloud native and all of the thinking of nimbleness and the ability to innovate is really what we're after. And that's the thing that will get us to be able to tap in the other silos that we don't normally tap into. So that's kind of the reason why we're talking about this this month. So I think that sort of wraps it up nicely, and also wraps it up because we're way past 4 o'clock. With that, obviously a great conversation. Thank you all. Thanks, Keith, for joining us. And
welcome, Keith.
Thank
Okay,
you.
Keith.
Appreciate
Thanks,
it.
Keith.
Thank you.
and we'll see you next week. And hope you have a great week.
See you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, I'll
Bye-bye.
see ya.
Cheers.
Bye.